Very busy schedule planned for you this morning with some very, very provocative and engaging presentations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. First speaker known as Karen Gallagher Burt, or at Canadian KGB. Karen is the Director of Philanthropy and Stewardship with Canadian Mental Health Association, based here in Calgary. Her portfolio includes communications, fund development, and community events. Karen has a graduate degree in social work and has spent her entire career focused on children and families at risk, crisis intervention, mental health, and well-being. The title of her topic this morning, Stress Management and Healthy Coping, the Importance of Staying Well, is going to be so apropos. Karen wears so many different hats, but doesn't like labels. Her many, many accomplishments include being a 37-year life partner, mom to 50 children, a community connector, a political nerd, and mental health advocate, and a gamer. She admits to having a very complicated relationship with coffee and wine. Swears, apparently quite a lot. At Canadian KGB, great Twitter handle. Karen is constantly keeping all of us on a very even keel. I've known Karen for a while, and she brings high energy, passion, and a deep understanding of well-being to every conversation that she is in, and particularly those that she leads. Without further ado, we're very happy to have Karen join us this morning on stress management and healthy coping, the importance of staying well.
Well, thank you, Bruce. That was a kind introduction. I very much appreciate it. I don't know why you guys made me go after that video, because now I'm all weepy watching the video. And I do want to mention that I'm a first-generation Canadian, and my parents, when they immigrated, didn't have the best of times adapting to Canada, even though they were English-speaking, they were Caucasian, and they were Christian, which seemed to fit in all the mainstays here in Canada. They had a pretty negative experience as new Canadians. Although I will say my parents came from Liverpool, England, so I'm not sure their English actually qualifies as English. The accent is pretty in-depth. But I have much gratitude for not only, obviously, the country that has been my home, but also the fact that we are a country that not only welcomes, but is built upon the combination of those of us who've come here to make this our home. And I'm very pleased to be here to present to all of you. Stress these days looks very different than it looked before, and very much about stress has been something that we all experience on a regular basis, and we all experience multiple kinds of stress, but the COVID pandemic has changed things immensely. So I would love to go through a quick presentation with you. I'm not very heavy on using slides. I will use them, but it's not my preference to speak with slides. But I think it's really critical to have something to base the foundation on. So when I think about stress, there is multiple ways of looking at it. But most importantly, I think we have to talk about the different kinds of stress that are out there. When we think about mental health and mental well-being, and I like the fact that we use those words, not mental illness. What we're talking about something that is proactive, something that is there to help you move through all of the challenges that face you. But when I think about stress, I think about the negative sides of it. I think about how it makes me feel physically poor, how it makes me feel mentally not really well. But there are some positives to stress. So hopefully in a very quick presentation, we'll walk through mental health itself, a bit about stress and the different ways it happens. But I want to really focus a little bit on the very beginning about COVID, and at the very end about some of the techniques that could help us, could help all of us. And trust me, I need them as well, very much these days. So I want to stress that notice I use the word again, I want to really enforce that we're talking about mental health versus mental illness. The language we tend to use is that we talk about when people become ill with something, and automatically what comes to mind, usually with mental illness, is diagnoses such as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. And we start to put labels in there associated with a mental illness. Well, the reality is while 1 in 5 Canadians, and I believe it's actually changing to about 1 in 4, are going to experience a mental health or substance use event or period during their life, we know that all Canadians, 1 in 5, instead of 1 in 5, it's 5 in 5 will experience mental health. And so we're always looking at that well-being side of things. We tend to think about in our profession mental health on a continuum. So across the middle there on the green bar, you see maximum mental health or mental illness on one side and minimal mental illness on the other side. And up the center, optimal mental well-being and minimal mental well-being. And what we're always trying to achieve is that right lower quadrant, a person who has no diagnosable mental illness and a low level or a no, oh, I got the wrong one, a low level of mental, sorry guys, I'm having a rough morning today and I'm going to apologize. We want to be in the top left quadrant, experience a high level of mental well-being despite having a mental illness, or in the right quadrant in the bottom, no diagnosable illness and a lower level of mental well-being. We want to be mixing these things up in our life, and we're always going to move in these continuums. We want to ensure that we're taking care of our mental health throughout all stages of our life, and it starts with childhood and teaching our kids coping mechanisms, moving through adolescence, which is the biggest challenge of all, but then moving into adulthood where we have the coping strategies to manage both our well-being and then any stress that comes at us. And these are all strategies. You are not born or designed to be able to cope well with these things. They're all things that we learn. They're behaviors we learn. They're ways of looking at things that we can change for ourselves. So if we want to stay on that right side, preferably in the upside, we need to consider where we are right now. And this for me has been the most important thing to talk about in any presentation over the last 15 months. And that is that what's happening to us mentally in terms of our health throughout the pandemic. And I'm going to say something that's not as positive at the beginning, but I want to end it with positiveness. And that is that right now, every single one of us is struggling with our mental health, whether we acknowledge it or we don't, or whether we unpack it and look at it. But I think every single person is experiencing something with their mental health, and they're on a lower level than they've ever been, and they're not functioning as well as they'd like to be. I put up this chart. This is a chart that comes from the United States, and this chart was actually designed to be looking at things like natural disasters and what happens in a community when a natural disaster takes place. I would say that it also applies very, very specifically to our pandemic. And when I throw this up here, I want you to consider the time that we've experienced the pandemic. So on the left side where it starts with a warning phase, that was probably last January, February for all of us, where we were hearing things, we were seeing things in the media. We really hadn't had much impact here yet in Canada, but we were starting to be aware of it. So there was a warning side, but we weren't overly concerned. We were paying attention. And then mid-March, we had an impact. And that would have been, for me, March 13th was my last full day in the office. And then we were basically sent home, and we've worked from home ever since. So that impact for me was March 13th. And for most of us, it would be the beginning of March, mid-March, where we really felt the impact. And you'll notice that the emotional highs, they go down a little bit at that point, and bam, we have that impact. And it's very difficult. But we actually rallied as a country, and I'd say as a province, very well. And very quickly, we moved into what's called the heroic stage. So heroic stage started to happen, I'd say, end of April through May, where everybody came out to help. And I compare that to the flood in Calgary, the fires in Fort McMurray, where after the impact, the community comes together to support one another. And that's what we did. During the hero stage, for example, in my job, I was really looking at taking care of donations that were being made, but they weren't financial ones. They were donations of items. And every dentist that I knew reached out and said, I'm not open. Can we give you our masks? Can we give you our gloves for our staff to use? And so those were the kinds of things that happened. People that might have been sick, we all stepped up and we helped them. And then we hit summer and we went through a honeymoon phase. And last summer, if any of you recall, we spent a good deal of our time outside. We were able to gather in groups outside comfortably. We kept the inside the house lower, but it was okay because it was summer, and not summer like we've just seen the last couple of days, but it was a beautiful weather. And we went through this fabulous time where we're like, okay, we got this. We can get through this. And then we dropped. And as you can see on the bottom of the scale, disillusionment stepped in. And that took place about September. And I'm guessing most of you can think about what happened last September. And the big one was our children went back to school. And that brought with it both, in some ways, a relief because we needed them to have routine and ritual. We wanted to make sure that they were doing okay, getting their learning in. But it brought a lot of fear about what they're going to be exposed to, what we're going to experience, and then some challenges, particularly for parents as we've gone in school, out of school, in school, out of school throughout that. So September was that first trigger event. And then we've been having trigger events ever since. So this stage is called disillusionment. And unfortunately, that's where we still are. We're still in the stage of disillusionment, particularly when it comes to how we're managing and coping with things. Usually, disillusionment lasts in a natural disaster. It's about a 6 to 12-month window. But during this pandemic, we haven't really come to the end of it. And I'm anticipating that it's probably going to be September-ish before we all sort of feel like we've come out of that a little bit. And then we'll move into that reconstruction phase and working through all of the experiences we have. So I wanted to put this up there because while this is all going on with the pandemic, what we're going to experience is what we call the echo pandemic. So the mental health concerns that are starting to rise up right now, honestly have not been fully addressed and will be a lot of fallout. Many of you have heard the term post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, and I believe that's what we're going to have in the mental health side of things as we move forward into recovery. So our echo pandemic will be falling behind probably by about another 18 months. So that's something for us to think about in terms of how we are coping personally, how our families are coping, and those around us, our friends here in this community potentially. And then if you are going into a new workplace, what that looks like in that workplace as well. So the theme of 2020 for me has been grief and loss. This last 15 months, what we have all experienced as a society is grief and loss, whether it's the actual grief and loss of losing someone to either COVID or potentially another illness during this past time. We have lost our ability to grieve together in the same way we would, but we've also lost many other things, and we are all experiencing the sense of this last year, 15 months, our life not only hasn't been what we expected it to be, but many of the milestone events in our lives we haven't been able to celebrate. I think of vacations, I think of graduations, weddings, baptisms or christenings for children. All of those things that bring us together as a community have been taken away. And that makes it extraordinarily difficult for us. And everyone is in this state of grief and loss to a greater or lesser degree. And I know that's the work that we specialize in here at Calgary at CMHA. Each CMHA is different, but this has been the overarching theme that we've been experiencing with all of our folks coming in, is this grief and loss about what was or was supposed to be and what didn't happen. And so bear that in mind when you're thinking about yourself and taking some self-compassion towards how you're feeling and what you're experiencing. And I think that this is where we're living. We're physically, emotionally, and we're mentally exhausted. I would actually say that we're actually at a point where we're almost depleted. And depleted to me means when you're exhausted or tired, rest and all of those good things we know will take care of our body will take us to that next place. But when you're depleted, it's like being that glass that's half empty and you keep adding water to it or wine to it, whatever it may be, but it's never getting full again. And I think a lot of us are in that place where we're depleted. We just feel that we don't have it in us to give. And as a society, we need to be paying attention to each other and looking at what that can look like for people and how we can support them. So bear in mind, if you're in these areas, not only are you normal, you are very much part of our whole society right now in terms of everybody's got some level of this happening for them. So stress among all of this is important to talk about just in how it impacts us physically, mentally, behaviorally, and what that can look like and help our days or help or be more of a hindrance to our days. So stress really is all about the brain. And when stress happens to us, the chemicals in our brain will change and we start to release different chemicals that affect how our body functions. So when our brain perceives a threat, and if we go right back to cave person days, so maybe the woolly mammoth is coming towards us, we've got to kill it, the stress level goes up and certain chemicals release that allow us then to have a bit more spurt of energy. This is what I always describe as the mom being able to lift something off a child that they would never have been able to do before. But when it's your child in danger, all of these chemicals surge through our bodies and we have strength that we didn't realize. But it's short term. It's not a long time that we have that, and our natural response to it varies, and we'll talk about that. And then when those chemicals deplete, when the stress goes away, whatever particular event it is, then our brain goes back to normal. And this is why I talk about the pandemic, in that our brains haven't gone back to this normal regulation. I think we're all at a slightly higher or elevated amount of stress all the time. So our brains have not had this opportunity to go back to what we consider to be easy, normal, our regular routines, whatever that looks like, that our brain is functioning well, and we're getting a different set of chemicals coursing through our body. Our happiness chemicals are much more present. So when we get that stress, our body responds in a variety of ways. And they talk about it with the 3 F's: fight, flight, or freeze. I would add a 4th one in there, that sometimes we faint. And for me, that means not just the freeze, but the withdrawal and the inability to kind of manage anything. And when that happens, all of these things start to happen in our body. So you'll notice everything goes up except for one down at the bottom, the digestive side of things. That slows down. And if any of you had a moment you can examine that's been highly stressful for you, it will come across in different ways within your body. One of these may be more important that comes up for you than others. I know for me, the big thing for me is muscle tension. When I'm stressed, everything in my neck, my shoulders, my lower back will tighten. And then when I do get calmer and the stress hormones go down, I have a hard time releasing that muscle tension because the chemicals keep it elevated. So we all have different ones that will manifest for us in a higher or lower or lesser degree. The digestive action is always interesting to me. When we're stressed, everything slows down. Once we become less stressed, everything moves up. So you can imagine what that does for your system. So exactly like that, if we look at the stress response, oh, my screen just froze. Hopefully this will go forward. Then when we become relaxed, everything goes down and the digestion goes up. And that's very much the exact opposite what our body experiences. So our temperature goes down, our pulse goes down. And so if you imagine your body doing this up and down with all of these different chemicals, and it affects your breathing, your muscles, your heart rate, all of that go up and down with a stress response or a decrease in stress. So what that means is that we're experiencing it all the time. A big part of this is how you perceive the threat, what you think that threat is doing to you. So a life-threatening event, COVID, very much could be in that category. When we see it as a negative experience and a terrifying experience. But there are times when stress is good and it's positive. And there's 3 different kinds of stress, and I'm touching on them only quickly, but we want to talk about how stress can actually be good in your brain, that in a normal, regular life, and I don't know that we'll ever get that again, that your brain can perceive it as a challenge. And challenge stress is actually a good thing. That's what you get when you're competing in a sport, or where you're trying to set a best goal for yourself with something like a runner. When you have a goal set for finance to save a certain amount of money and you achieve that goal, we may be stressed getting there, but that excitement when we achieve the goal is actually considered a kind of stress, but it's a good stress and one that's positive. But our body reacts the same way. So external stressors are pretty common for all of us. And the routine ones we deal with, and I know the folks in Edmonton had a nice dump of snow yesterday, so weather can absolutely be part of that on our regular life. Things such as tests, exams. I think the too many commitments is very common for many of us, those of us who are type A's, way too many things on our plate, but even things like traffic. So those are just sort of the average ones that we would deal with on a regular basis. But then we have the major stressors that come in. And being a new Canadian, that itself is a major stressor. So you've already got one there that's happening within your body. Then add in any of the other things that could be happening that we'd see as a bigger life event. So obviously a divorce, but I would also say a wedding and a marriage can be a big stress, an external stressor. A loss, again, it could be someone to COVID and to the disease, but it also could be a loss of a relationship and a breakup. And then all of these other ones combined in there, and illness obviously being prevalent right now, are some of the major stressors we can experience in our life. So if any of you out there during this last 15 months have experienced the illness, so the COVID, whatever that looks like for you, you perhaps have had someone, your partner or yourself has been pregnant, you're considering legal things, you've added 2-3 things on your life that are considered major stressors. And that keeps that level of stress hormones very high on a continual basis, and we need to be concerned. Internally, this is where the damage is done the most, and that is how we start to behave and then what happens in our brains. So generally speaking, we don't take care of our body as well. We don't get enough rest. We don't get healthy eating patterns. And I don't like to say good or bad, but our healthy patterns start to decrease. And sometimes we struggle with doing things, that procrastination, and then frequently the negative thoughts start to come into our heads. And it's been proven that we have more conversations with ourselves than with anyone else, and we're the cruelest to ourselves. How we speak to ourselves in our brain is very, very difficult and very hard. And for most of us, especially if we've been experiencing being alone more or isolated more, those negative thoughts are on the upside of things, on the upswing. So when that happens, the effects of stress really impact us in these 4 areas: our emotions, our thoughts, our body, and then our behaviors. So on the emotional side, these are some of the words I'm sure that would come to each of you when you think about how you emotionally respond to stress. Have a look at the list. I'm not going to read it through, but pick out kind of the 1, 2, 3 things that you think are what resonate with you when you feel stressed. What are the words that scream at you and say, this is where I'm at? I know for me, it becomes an anxiety and a worry, which takes up a lot of energy in order for me to imagine what could happen, which is always difficult because my brain puts imagination into reality and I perceive the worst to come. So that's usually where I fall in, is the anxious and the worried, but also sometimes the unhappy and the depressed. A little bit of that sneaks in for me as well. Your thinking starts to range in different ways and either works poorly or overworks, where you're thinking about something and chewing it on in your brain for way too long. And that can manifest in multiple ways. But I would say during pandemic, we've all increased that negative self-talk for sure. And that worry is there because we have no control over the pandemic other than our own behaviors. And some of these are things that start to creep in. I know for me, that inability to concentrate comes up. As well as, again, that worrying is very much important for me. I have to pay attention to how much time and energy I'm giving to something. I have experienced a bit more negative self-talk during this last 15 months than I ever have before. And then the body. The body manifests in various ways. We talked about what goes up and what comes down with the stress hormones. The physical effects of stress will manifest in a variety of ways. The bottom 2 are the ones that are kind of the worst ones, and they usually come after prolonged periods of stress. Many of us fall in those other categories, and if you think about it, our lowered immunity right now is part of what we're experiencing in a time when we need our immune systems to be strong. Again, pick and choose kind of what is in there for you that resonates. For myself, I know that it tends to be headaches. That's where it comes in. My stress comes in here, and then my head starts to ache and pound. That's one of my big stress physical signs. And then this is the toughie. This is the behavioral side. You folks are in a place where right now you're so much adaptation in your life. And then you've got this extra stress of COVID while you're looking for a job, while you're adapting to a country with very different, probably some societal things. But the weather, for sure, I would say, is one of my big ones. And I know it was a big stress for my family figuring out what weather would do for them going forward. They moved to Winnipeg first, so I'm just saying that was not the best choice. Behaviorally, we start to do things that I would say are less healthy for us. We start to see responses increase of substances, smoking, perhaps consumption of cannabis, alcohol for sure. And many people talk about the first few months of the pandemic. They gained 10, 15 pounds. They were eating more junk food. They were definitely drinking more, consuming more alcohol. I know for me, my caffeine intake has gone up exponentially. And we start to move into these behaviors as part of the stress response. So when we talk about all of these different things with stress, then we have to talk about how we'll get out of it. And how we get out of it is by paying attention to these different areas of our wellness. There's many different charts like you'll see like this with different areas. Generally speaking, these 7 are the top ones, but there are other ones you might see that have 5 or 10, depending upon who's presenting them. But I like to look at the 7 different areas, and I remind myself there's 7 days of the week, and there should be different ways I'm looking at different ones and examining my behavior. I think it's really critical to talk about the spiritual one. And lots of folks put spiritual down to religion, and I don't. I think for us in mental health, spiritual for us is a way of feeling connected to whatever it is that brings you that passion. So for me, nature is a very spiritual place to be. Community is very spiritual for me. And some quiet time and meditation and introspection is spiritual. So that's how I look at spirituality. All of the other different areas there, we will have impact on to varying degrees, including the environmental side of things. And by that, I certainly don't mean environment necessarily as weather, but the circumstances in which we're living, we're playing, and we're working. And in many cases, as your own, working towards a job. That's a job in itself. So all of these different areas are where we talk about focus of wellness. Our world tells us we need to be balanced. I'm going to be really frank, that doesn't exist. We can never be at absolute the right capacity for each one of these at any given time. It's a work in progress. It is, the word they use is journey. I think for me, it's a bit of a roller coaster, that I'm really good focusing on one area, but something else gets depleted. I never feel that all 7 areas are fully balanced, but I tend to focus most on the ones where I feel I'm not as regular or consistent on. So I focus a lot on my physical wellness because I'm not consistent with that. And I focus a lot on my intellectual because that also gives me a lot of hope. And when I see new things, new research, new innovations out there, those make my brain feel good. So those are the different 7 areas we consider. But most importantly, what I want you to think about is which ones are you perhaps not spending any time on that need a little bit more attention. So there's lots of strategies. There's lots of strategies out there, and you will already have some natural ones that are part of what you do. Everybody has coping strategies for how they respond to stress and what that looks like. But there are some that we know that are not as positive and not as healthy for us. And these 4 are the ones that we tend to seep into the most as we're trying to cope with things. So we start to do that overthinking and that worrying, and then most of the thoughts become negative, and then anxiety increases. So go back to that picture of the brain at the beginning where we showed the lightning around the brain. Think about all these things happening within your brain, and your brain is constantly being aggravated. It's like a sore on your body that you keep picking at, and it doesn't heal because you're not paying attention to what it actually needs to heal. And that's what's happening within our brains. So when we think about all of these things going through, it's helpful to try and stop some of those processes, to sort of consider what they are and label them. What is that? Unpack it like it's something you're taking out of your brain and examining. What's going on here for me? And then potentially writing it down can be helpful as well. And that also could be in artwork or creative activities. So the thought labeling for me is a critical component because I know that as a worrier, I will build things up in my head, and all of a sudden that proverbial molehill becomes a mountain because I can't get my brain to slow down. And so finding ways to deal with that are really critical for me. I like to try and stop the process when I get caught there, and playing mind games with myself. And I use this very, very consistently in that it is a bit of a game you're doing in your brain. But also using games as part of taking myself out of that. So simple things like doing what's called the alphabet game. Alphabet game for me has always been something I've done since a child, and I didn't realize it was a technique. And that is that I'll start with the letter A, and I'll say, A, my name is Anne, my husband's name is Andy, we come from Alberta, and we sell apples. And then I'll walk through the alphabet and do that with each letter in the alphabet. And it's one way to take my brain off what I'm ruminating on to something else. Other things that work are counting backwards. And if you're really good at that, then do the alphabet backwards. I think learning another language, if I get good at those, I start to learn numbers in a different language. And then it takes your brain to another place where it takes it off the stream of worrying. And then the writing it down, an art project, as someone who has frequently described themselves as non-artistic, I'm working a lot on trying to become artistic in terms of a creativity with physical mediums. My artistic nature comes out in writing. I'm trying to do some other things that use a different part of my brain. So some of these strategies are ways that you can move off of that. I also always invite people to think what you're saying in your head, we know is not always healthy. So think about what you're experiencing. And if this was your best friend, if this was your partner, if this was someone in your life, your child, what suggestions or advice would you give to them? And I use advice very carefully because I'm not a believer in giving other people advice, but I certainly need to give it to myself. So if someone else was coping with what I'm coping with, so they are with COVID, how would I suggest that they look at things? How would I ask them to perceive things, or to narrow the focus down to what they can control and they can't control, and really only focus on what they can control? We often can think about how we would solve things for other people much better than ourselves. And so really trying to take that second perspective, that outside perspective of what's going on for you. I want to finish talking about what's the mental health vaccine. We're all talking about getting our vaccine. I'm sure many of us have. I'm quite happily a month in. But I think that there is a vaccine that's for our mental health. And those things I've talked about, coping strategies, having our support in our community, ensuring that we have things that are accessible, that we're accessing, everything feeds down to 3 areas that we know are the keys. They're absolute keys to mental wellness. And that is feeling a sense of connection, feeling like you belong. And those 2 things together move you to a place of hopefulness, because we measure mental anguish by a person's sense of hopelessness. When you feel hopeless, that's when we're the most concerned. But when you feel hopeful, that's how we move forward together. And those 3 things feed into each other. I believe it comes in this pattern, that we have to feel a sense of connection, which is much of what Kryak and Eric provides for us, that sense of connection. When we have that connection, then it feeds into a sense of belonging, that we have a community that we're part of, that is something that we can turn to, that we can share our own skills, that we can help. It's not just about taking, but it's about giving. And then when we get those 2 things together, that hope starts to blossom. And that seems to be the place that we need to live. So the theme of 2021, I think, it comes with these R words. It's that resilience, which all of you, I know, have experienced, that resilience that you need to get through all these life changes. It's a sense of recovery. That will be the physical, the mental, the spiritual, all of those areas. We will feel a sense of recovery coming forward. It also gives us that chance to reconnect for sure, but our ability to refocus. And I think that the pandemic, while I would never say that it's had good things about it, what I will say that we have an opportunity to pull good things from it. And I believe that many of us have refocused our lives a little bit and determined what's more important than others. Lots of folks have said that that heavy schedule that they followed before isn't working for them. Working at home perhaps is better. Their church community, they can still commit during it, doing a virtual service. But I think that refocus really gives us that passion to move forward as we recover and through the next time. So I'm going to leave the presentation component there, because I do think the presentation is always boring. Personally, I think slides are boring. But I want to stop and see if there was any questions that came up for folks, and if any of this resonated with you. I know we talk a lot about our mental health and our mental strengths. I like to own my own concerns that have come up, and that is that during this pandemic, I have actually been diagnosed with depression. And I'm someone who feels I have great coping mechanisms, I have great strategies, I have wonderful resources around me. But last August, I reached a point where I thought, I'm not sure that I can do this all by myself. I'm exercising, I talk to someone regularly, I have a pretty healthy lifestyle, and it wasn't enough to help my brain. My brain said, no, this isn't good enough. So I had to add medication in August. And I'm proud that I did it. I'm not feeling a sense of loss or a sense of weakness. I feel that it's a strength to say, during this time, I haven't been able to cope as well as I'd like to, and therefore I need a little assistance from my doctor. I always think of these things in that layer. What can you do yourself personally? What wellness activities can you practice? If that's not working, what do you add to your body in terms of your exercise, for sure, your nutrition, changing those things up? What kind of things am I bringing in for joy, such as the yoga that's going to be done later? But then the last part is that sometimes I need someone else to help me that has a different professional standing. So I open that up for you to consider. That's certainly not a weakness.
That was amazing, Karen. I feel already better, much better.